Cuando los organizadores me propusieron participar en esta conferencia, concretamente en esta mesa que abordaba
when we were invited to this panel session, I thought there were two possibilities. I could talk about small islands that are located 200 kilometers away from Europe and from the Sahara, or whether I should talk as a consultant who carries out some activities in Africa. And I finally decided to speak in my latter capacity, and I have my Nigerian colleague, Michael Mbusi, and I received over 260 pages to read on the Sostenuto project, so I'm going to take a very general approach. According to the Conference of United Nations, UNTAC, creative economy represents 3.4% of the whole of world trade. The African share of this trade is calculated to be about 1%. Since the 90s, UNTAC has looked at the statistics for creative and cultural industries, and the concept applied to the trade sector, looking at it from a social aspect, identity, access to culture, creativity, literacy, languages, and so on. Since the end of that decade, a structure of economic parameters has emerged, and as a result, comparative data for the culture-based economy. The African case, and speaking in general terms, the plans to incentivize the culture-based economy through public subsidies, infrastructures, partnerships, and cooperation agreements have only responded to the social function of a cultural need. The economic dimension in its broadest sense has been left aside, has been left in rhetoric, or even ignored. There is no reliable statistical data, neither comparative data nor historical data. We have an exception, perhaps the case of Nigeria and some countries in Western Africa. We have some data on employment, exports, imports, and so on, and there is no African country that has any regulatory system regulating salaries, labor conditions, and other standards.
Between 70 to 95%, depending on the countries and the sectors, of the production of creative economy is carried out by SMEs of the informal sector, that is flying below the radar, and the large decisions plans and instruments. But in Africa, they read, publish books, they hold festivals, all kinds of performances. Music bands export their product and tour. Plastic arts are sold on a large scale. The cinema industry produces dozens of thousands of units in each of the informal markets of the continent, and none of these outputs is reflected on the statistics. In spite of the absence of empirical data that are not just an academic obsession, the absence of empiric data are an obstacle for the support of these products. In spite of the absence of this data, we have indicators that allow us to make certain statements on this sector of the African economy. I'll be very brief. First of all, the sustained growth of a cultural economy based on reliable data includes Africa. Africa is connected to global capital cities, cultural capital cities. The links between cultural production in Africa and global trade are fed by the African diaspora that has grown incredibly in the last 25 years. Third, in spite of the fact that the added value of this cultural chain is generated outside Africa in more dynamic markets, it's also true that the production of African products is increasing in the African continent. There are indications that there is a certain structural relocation of cultural activities in the African continent. Fourth, in the base of the pyramid, most organizations are small, emerging organizations with a short life, generated by their own owners and informal. We are talking about self-employment, while the cultural activity of entrepreneurs is materialized with other sources of income, for example, other realities. These organizations that respond to this typology keep a very limited relationship with the state. Fifth, while presenting a chaotic aspect in terms of lack of regulation, this economic sector is efficient, flexible, and often highly qualified, highly skilled. It presents skills from the managerial viewpoint in a context where access to credit does not exist. Capital is generated by a combination of intelligence for negotiating prices and an intensive marketing activity. On top of a large informal sector, there is also a layer of formal structures that are registered as companies, NGOs, associations, cooperatives, or consulting firms. On top of the African case, this sector, this layer, top layer, represents between 5 to 10% only of production and turnover, depending also on the nations and the sectors that are considered, because there are large differences between audiovisual production or publishing, book publishing. This top layer, this summit of the pyramid, represents just 5 to 10% of the production, but holds a strategic position in relation to the state and in respect to the funding and international financiers. This top of the pyramid depends on funding from development, international cooperation, and the link to certain suppliers. And the seventh consideration, or trade, if we consider this African sector overall, formal and informal, integrated by this top layer, formal and informal, informed by micro initiatives, access to credit is insignificant. From an economic viewpoint, external funding, particularly from international cooperation, holds the place of the initial investment capital. 3 comments to conclude. The reluctance shown by this cultural sector in Africa is normal because they have received a significant amount of credit and they have kept jobs, lifestyles and income in a more dynamic and sustainable way than most formal economy. In Africa, the field of creativity consists in obtaining top priority in political agenda, moving on in the construction of models that underline how culture is related to the reality of the different areas and communities will reinforce arguments in favor of this central position. It will reinforce arguments in favor of the need to manage in a smart way cultural capacities as a condition for development. That is, development understood as an increase of our own symbolic universe, and reality, that is, development understood as freedom. And so, good luck, Sostenuto.